Hi, everybody. This is Diego from LAMDL. I'm the program manager for File Curriculum, and I'm making this quick video to bring up some spring updates that are relevant for the tournament coming up. There have been some new additions to the files that have been available since T3. Hopefully you've been able to take a look at those. If not, this video is meant to be a quick summary about what those file updates are so that you are ready for the tournament coming up. Um, the big update is that in the JV division, there is a new affirmative, and it is about Alaskan oil. Along with the new affirmative brings a new disad that is specific to the case, a new counterplan that is also specific to the case, a topicality argument that refines what development means, and some critique updates as well. So normally the JV division does have two affirmatives. The reason that the second one was added up until this semester is because we stalled a little bit during the summer because there was an affirmative that we had originally planned to be read for the entire season, but Trump passed a bill that would have funded the affirmative, and so that sort of pushed us back on this new affirmative. But nonetheless, it is here, and we're excited to have you all debate about it. So I'm going to be giving a summary about just what the affirmative is about, what you can expect to argue against it when you're on the negative side, and hopefully you are excited to debate it as well. So, new affirmative has to do with Alaskan oil. The quick summary of this is that currently, right now, Trump is opening up many areas in Alaska for oil and gas drilling. He's giving permits to a bunch of companies, and if he's not giving permits, he's making the ability to grant them a lot easier than before. On top of that, we knew that going into his administration, part of his election slogan was drill, baby, drill. And a lot of it did censor on Alaska, and so he is really wants to open up big regions of Alaska for even more oil and gas drilling. He thinks it's necessary for like U.S. economy, U.S. exports, all those things. The affirmative is going to argue that this drilling is bad for two reasons. The first one is that it continues Arctic colonialism. This is the subsistence advantage. It is the first advantage you are going to see inside the files. Subsistence refers to practices that indigenous communities use to survive off of the environment around them. It includes cultural practices that are specific to those indigenous groups inside Alaska, and it is something that should be protected under federal law, but because of these new permits and the ability for oil and gas drilling to increase as a result of the Trump administration, the argument that the affirmative is going to make is that this is a continuation of a legacy of Arctic colonialism by the U.S. Federal government against these indigenous people. This can happen in multiple ways. Whenever an increase in oil drilling is done inside Alaska, it's usually done in surrounding indigenous communities, and the pollution that always happens as a result of this drilling tends to harm indigenous communities. The first way is just like pollution around the area leads to health disparities such as asthma, respiratory diseases, things like that. But the second is in the actual food practices. So, for example, there are indigenous communities in Alaska that may rely on like sea life as a way of maintaining their cultural diets. And when we drill for oil or when we drill for natural gases, what ends up happening is that chemicals, a bunch of pollutants get released inside the nearby ecosystems. They tend to contaminate the fish and all the wildlife around it. And those are food sources that indigenous communities rely on. And when they eat those fish or when they eat certain sea life and other creatures, it ends up going into their systems as well, which causes health disparities as well. So the first advantage is about more structural disparities as a result of oil and gas drilling. Uh, this is a soft left affirmative. What this means is that if you want to go for the subsistence advantage that is about indigenous people and the impact of colonialism, it requires you to win that structural forms of violence outweigh traditional extinction scenarios. So the first advantage is not going to say that these lack of subsistence practices or the harm of oil drilling to indigenous communities, it is not going to argue that these things result in some like total extinction event like the deep sea mining affirmative does. It is instead going to argue that we should focus on structural conditions of violence first. The structural condition of violence in this case being colonialism, not just as an event that's happening like 400 years ago, but it's also something that continues now in the form of oil drilling. That oil drilling is part of a legacy of settler colonialism in Alaska. So that is the first advantage that the Alaskan oil affirmative is going to have. The second one is pretty similar to the climate advantage inside the deep sea mining affirmative, but it's very specific to Alaskan rainforests. The argument is going to be that with oil and gas drilling, it has a very adverse impact to the ecosystem surrounding Alaska. And, the 1AC is going to have cards that say that when you disrupt the Alaskan ecosystem, it disrupts like global ecosystems. It's a spill out argument that says that if you harm a crucial ecosystem such as Alaskan rainforest, it's going to spill over, it's going to have a spillover effect into global collapses in other ecosystems. Think of it like a food chain collapse. If there is one part of an ecosystem that collapses, the other parts eventually collapse because everything is interdependent and relies on each other. The Wednesday has robust evidence to defend this, and it says that when there are such like cataclysmic events that harm the Alaskan ecosystem and that spills out, that can get existential, that it starts to impact the climate in a very big way. It impacts weather patterns, it increases the risk of wildfires, just overall a bunch of bad things. And that second one is a lot more of a traditional extinction impact scenario. So the Alaskan oil affirmative has two different routes to go. You can choose to read one advantage as the entire 1AC, or you can read both. It's completely up to you. But those are the two advantages that the affirmative is going to have. The plan is simple. It just bans Alaskan oil and gas drilling and does not allow for the possibility of new permits to be granted or new leases to be granted as well. The negative gets, uh, to be honest, very defensive arguments. So, in no world should you be going for a 2NR that is only case against this affirmative. Soft left affirmatives usually don't have much offense on case. Your like negative teams are more so focused on mitigating the solvency of the affirmative or like the impact explanations. And so, this is a very traditional case negative against a soft left affirmative like the Alaskan oil affirmative. Against the first advantage, subsistence, negative teams can argue four different types of arguments. The 1NC shell is going to look like it's in this order, and then you're going to have a bunch of 2NC and 1NR arguments to supplement these claims as well. The first one is that the affirmative is going to make claims that like no indigenous groups want oil, or that in order to do right for indigenous communities, we must completely ban oil. The first argument that the negative is going to make is that there are indigenous groups that actually want oil extraction to occur in Alaska. They've grown, some of them, some of the tribes in Alaska have grown to be dependent on an oil-based economy, and if you take away the ability of them to drill oil in partnership with like governments or like corporations, contracts, etc., that could harm their local communities, which might have the opposite effect of what the affirmative wants. The second one is that there are alternative causes to subsistence harm, so like harms to subsistence practices. So, for example, it's not just oil drilling that impacts indigenous subsistence practices. It could also be other legal disputes between corporations that the affirmative does not solve for. It's not meant to be a complete solvency takeout, but it is meant to at least say that the affirmative doesn't really solve as much as they say they are. Third argument that the negative gets against the subsistence advantage is no solvency. Climate change is inevitable. It's going to come at some point, is all this argument is saying. And then the fourth part is consequentialism first. So maybe you want to go for the disad and go for a more traditional extinction impact through the oil disad as the negative. You need to explain why those impacts come first on a philosophical level against a soft left affirmative, because remember, the soft left affirmative is going to say that we should consider structural conditions of violence first. So things that are more like high probability, they're happening now. They have a legacy of violence as opposed to like a hypothetical extinction scenario. You as the negative need to have an ethical defense of why big stick impacts come first. So you have a card explaining why consequentialism should come first as well. Um, Second advantage is the ecosystem collapse one. You get a couple of arguments. they are mainly defensive arguments. So the negative can say again, no impact to climate change. Oil and gas extraction is limited in Alaska. Even if it does happen, it won't have as big of an impact as the affirmative states. Biodiversity destruction is already happening, similar to the climate change inevitable argument in Advantage 1, and then no impact to biodiversity loss. So you're saying that these impacts are inevitable, and even if they are, there is not much of an impact that's going to be had. All right. The new disad that the negative gets is the oil disad. This is just you saying oil is good as the negative. The affirmative is going to have all these reasons why oil is bad for the environment. The negative gets a different spin on it and says Alaskan oil is actually very necessary for the economy, not just like Alaska's economy, but the national economy as well. If we aren't drilling oil, then prices drive up for things like gas, for things just like affording oil, distributing it among the population in the first place. A total ban on oil in Alaska would drive up prices and inflation since Alaska is a key place where we want to mine for more oil. And that would cause a total economic collapse according to the negative. There's pretty good evidence indicating why this would be the case. And the impact argument is going to be that total economic collapse would destabilize international relations and cause war. There's a 1 in C piece of impact evidence, and there's a bunch of cards that are pretty robust in explaining the scenario. It just talks about the weakening of the international system. If one country loses its ability to continuously grow its economy, it starts to get more unstable, starts to lose confidence in its ability to project things like soft power across alliances, and then that overall drives up the risk of conflict. As the affirmative, you mainly get one approach. I think it's a pretty obvious approach that you should be taking against the oil dissat, right? The negative is going to have certain arguments that say, oil is not only good for the economy, but it doesn't have as big of an impact on the environment as the affirmative says it does. But, as the affirmative, you want to make a complete 180 against this oil dissat. So, for example, you're going to set up a link to an argument as the affirmative. First, energy transitions from oil are inevitable. Oil is not necessary. This is a myth that the negative is propping up. Instead, these transitions are going to happen at some point. It's just a question of when, not if. After that, you're going to set up your turns. You get two turns against this oil dissat. The first one is economic growth is bad, so you are turning the impact of the negative. Negative says economic growth is good because it avoids like these extinction level events about war. Uh, the affirmative is going to say, like, no, that is not true. Economic growth is bad. Growth actually increases the risk of conflict, makes like countries extremely overconfident in their ability to deter other enemies. But economic growth also drives up like environmental impact issues, and that's bad for like the whole climate change arguments that the affirmative is making in the 1AC, which leads to the second term, which is just like oil's bad. Who cares if like it's necessary for the economy? The environment is something that is much more important in terms of preserving. And then the last part is just going to be some defense that says economic decline does not cause war. So the affirmative has a very straightforward approach against the oil dissad. You are just trying to prove that oil is not hyped up as the negative says it is. In fact, it's actually pretty bad. Okay. The new counter plan is consult indigenous people. So the summary of this counter plan is going to be that instead of passing the affirmative unilaterally, what that just means is we're passing it as like the federal government gets the final say on oil and drilling permits, all those things. The negative is instead going to say that we should consult indigenous groups concerning oil extraction. This conditions the plan based on indigenous approval. So the big difference between the affirmative and the negative is that whereas the affirmative immediately passes the plan without any like communication between federal and non-federal actors, the negative says we should wait and consult indigenous communities first. So that leaves open the possibility of saying yes or no to the plan based on whether or not indigenous communities want the affirmative to even happen. The argument is going to be that failure to consult replicates hierarchies of settler colonialism, where the federal government is always getting the final say over land use policies on like stolen land that never belonged to the federal government in the first place. And the second argument is going to be that Consultation also includes traditional ecological knowledge that is better for the environment. So there are arguments why the counterplan is better than the affirmative, and also some reasons why not doing the counterplan would reproduce the settler colonial hierarchies that the affirmative wants to challenge. There's going to be a big key term called free, prior, and informed consent that pops up a lot in the counterplan. It's the basis behind why the counterplan wants to consult indigenous people. Sometimes you'll see it as the full like words free, prior, and informed consent. Other times it's going to be an acronym where you see FPIC. Um, all free, prior, and informed consent means is it is a key principle in international human rights law that enables indigenous communities to be consulted on matters that affect them. So this counterplan is borrowing from international human rights law definitions on what free, prior, and informed consent means to inform just how we know what does it mean to consult indigenous people. How do we know that we are upholding the idea of consult? As the affirmative, another straightforward approach, you get permutations and solvency deficits. You're going to get permutation consultation as normal means. The reason I have it underlined is because normal means just means that this is a standard approach that the federal government already takes. Like there is no need for a counterplan that specifies free, prior, and informed consent because if you win that consultation is a normal means part of the affirmative plan, then it was like an already built-in component. Like the counterplan is fake, is what the affirmative is trying to say when they say that consultation is normal means. Like this was already a process of the plan. There's no need for the negative to exist, is what this permutation is saying. Um, you have a card to substantiate this as the affirmative. After that, it is just your job to prove that this is the case. The negative is going to have reasons why it is not normal means, and that is at the end of the day up for both sides to debate. After that, you're going to have a bunch of no solvency arguments that just say consultation does not provide any advantages that the negative states that it has. So even if, as the affirmative, you feel like the permutation is not the best route, you can always just win on counterplan doesn't solve the affirmative, or counterplan does not solve the advantages of the affirmative as well. Um, Next one is T development. I hope you're noticing that it relies on the same word. It just uses a slightly different definition. Whereas the deep sea mining affirmative faces off against a development definition that says development only means fossil fuel extraction. This one expands the scope just a little bit more and says that development only means affirmatives that talk about resource extraction. So that could be deep sea mining, it could be oil, it could be natural gas drilling, just anything that involves extracting resources from the Arctic. The violation is pretty obvious here, right? The negative says development means you have to like increase resource extraction. The violation is the affirmative literally bans resource extraction from being possible in Alaska. Um, so you can make a bunch of reasons why that's a pretty bad model of debate. If the affirmative is allowed to go in the opposite direction of the topic, remember the resolution says that the affirmative must always increase development or exploration. This affirmative literally reduces the ability for that to happen. That would make the topic bidirectional. Bidirectional just means that the affirmative can research the topic in both ways. If the affirmative can research the topic in both ways, then negative ground kind of becomes impossible. Like you can't read the oil dissent against an affirmative that increases exploration or development of the Arctic, for example. Um, as the affirmative, you get a counterinterpretation that development can also connote sustainability goals and improving indigenous cultural practices. So you can argue that the affirmative, by banning oil drilling, would improve sustainability goals since it's directed towards making sure that the environment is not as harmed as it is now. And you can argue that the result of the affirmative is that it improves indigenous cultural practices. So, yeah, I think that the topicality violation is very obvious here for the negative. It's up to the affirmative to defend why this counterinterpretation is better than the negatives. So that is the difference between this development topicality file and the other one that is used against the deep sea mining affirmative. Okay. The K update, it's pretty small, and that is because it is using the same literature base as the Imperial IR critique. It's the same K file for the deep sea mining F. The only thing that is different for the JV update is that new links are provided for the soft left portion of the 1AC. So, there are going to be links about what happens when settler colonial governments are making promises to indigenous communities. Often it is a history of cruel hope where whenever certain rights are granted to indigenous people or when indigenous people are uh, trying to be included within federal government policymaking, it just never ends up working out. It becomes a form of cruel optimism where the government says that they're going to do these things, but never follow up on those promises, or they end up being half measures where at first they sound really like radical in terms of their changing relationships with indigenous people, but they just end up falling back to the same, like, I believe the card is going to say a term like neoliberal apparatus, where at first it seems like like the government is going to create some sort of care program that is specific for indigenous people, but in the end, at the end of the day, the programs are either really hard to manage or the people that are responsible for the program usually like demean indigenous people in the process. There's a whole bunch of cards that are pretty good about giving these examples, and that is what the file is meant to be. So, if you are interested in reading the Imperial IR critique, I strongly suggest you use the new links that can be used against this 1AC because the original file only has links versus affirmatives that talk about China, or it only has uh, links that talk about like traditional international relations. This affirmative does not talk about international relations at all. It's very localized in terms of the groups of people it talks about in Alaska, and it only talks about climate change. You may be able to use some of the climate change links that are inside the original file, but again, the updates to the critique are meant so that you can use these links instead because they are more applicable to this affirmative than the ones you would originally use with the deep sea mining affirmative. With that being said, those are the new updates to the JV division specifically. Nothing else has changed for the rookie or novice division. And yep, good luck at the upcoming tournament, and hopefully you found this useful.